In this video, we're going to talk about how to configure Cisco devices using Ansible. Now, we're not going to go too far into the configuration. Basically, we're just going to go through the first couple of steps that are necessary in order to get it up and running. So what we're going to do is we have an environment and we want to first off verify connectivity. We want to make sure that we can connect to the Cisco router, in this case, with our Ansible machine. And that's going to be a simple SSH. We're then going to set up the inventory file. And actually, before we go any further, let's just stay right there. So let's verify connectivity and then set up our inventory file. So here I am, I'm on my Ansible machine. And I have a router, a Cisco router that I want to SSH into. Now I've previously SSH'd into this router and previously logged into this router, configured SSH and configured a user. That's a predecessor for this configuration. So I'm going to come in here, SSH. The user I created is called Cisco at 192.168.0.11. It previously asked me for the fingerprint, which I can accepted. So here it's asking me for the password, in which case it is a super secret password of Cisco. So here I can see I'm logged in. The pound sign here tells me I'm already in enable mode. So I already have full admin rights on here. If I do a show run, I can see the running configuration and everything. All right, so I've confirmed that I can verify connectivity. I'm going to open another tab here. Now I want to set up my inventory file. The inventory files for most Ansible information is pretty simple. I'm going to create a separate one specifically for this. I'm going to use Vi in order to edit it. Use your favorite editor. Vi happens to be one of mine. And we'll just call this Cisco inventory.txt. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a group called routers. In theory, all of my routers would be under here. And then here, I'm going to type in my router name. Let's just call this CSR1. Now, if I had DNS fully functional in my environment and I had a DNS record for CSR1, that's about all I would need to type in. Possibly csr1.example.com in order to fully qualify it. I don't have DNS working in my environment, and in fact, most locations don't have DNS set up for their network gear. So it's perfectly normal to have that, have a friendly name followed by an IP address. In this case, I'm going to do Ansible host equals and type in the IP address of the host. While I'm here, there's a couple of additional variables I want to add in here next to Ansible host. And that is going to be the username and password to log in. So I can put this all on one line. Ansible SSH user Cisco and Ansible SSH pass equals Cisco. I could have that all on one line. However, that starts to get a little complicated and a little difficult to read, especially if I have multiple routers and they all have the same username and password. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to move these down a couple of lines. I'm going to create a section called routers : vars. And what that means is that these are variables that are assigned to the routers group. So every router I have in here, right now it's only one, but I might have had 10. They will all use the same username and password. So if they all use the same username and password, this is one great way of having all of your variables in one place to keep everything centralized. So I'm going to save that. So that was our inventory file. All right, so we've gone ahead, we've verified connectivity, we've set up our inventory file, so we should now be able to log in. Now we want to create our first playbook. That will just give us some information about the server, or about the network device. So, on my system, I have a directory called playbooks. Oh, no, I don't. Okay, I'll create it right here. So Vi, I'm going to create a file just called Cisco info. .yml. YML is the YAML file. Start off with 3 dashes, hosts, and here we specified the group of hosts that we want, which was routers. Be very careful if you called your group in your inventory file router, singular, you have to use the same name here, so then it would be router. I believe I type routers, so I'm going to stay with that. Next thing we want to do is, by default, Ansible tries to run a gather facts script. And we don't want this to happen with our network gear. A lot of times network gear, one, if you could gather facts, on one, a lot of them you can't necessarily gather facts, and then two, they're fairly low-end CPUs, so we don't want to overburden them gathering a bunch of information we don't need. So we're going to just say gather facts false. Don't automatically gather information about these network devices. The second thing we have to do is specify the connection. So what happens is we want this command to actually run on the local Ansible machine. We don't want to copy this script up to the network device and then try to run it remotely. We want it to run locally on our Ansible machine and SSH into the remote host, SSH into our router in order to run the commands. So we have to specify a connection local. Some devices, it will still work if you have if you don't have the connection local, because they are capable of running scripts that Ansible provides them. However, not all devices support that, and you will get a weird SSH not supported error message. Basically, that means come back, change connection to local. All right, in here, we now want to run some tasks. And we have 2 tasks that we want to run. Let's see, name. Let's just call this one show version. Show iOS version. And in here, we're going to run an iOS underscore command. And specifically commands and show version. So the iOS command module, what it does is it literally takes all the commands you type it and types them onto the Cisco router. So here I'm on my router. If I type in show version, we will see I get some output. And that is exactly what the iOS command module does, is it passes what you've typed over. Now, because we want to do this as a demonstration, just our very first connecting to a Cisco device, making sure everything works, we want to capture the output here. And so we're going to use what's called register, which captures the output of the show version command. And then we'll call this variable 1. What it does is it captures the output of that command up above. So it captures this and then stores it into a variable called variable 1. Now that it's captured it, let's go ahead and have another task in here, and we'll just call this report information. And in here, we'll use the debug module in order to return the debugged information that's stored in variable 1. All right, so what's going to happen is we're going to connect up to the routers group. We're not going to gather facts. We're going to run this locally so that it's running across SSH as opposed to copying the script and running it remotely. We're then going to run some commands. Specifically, we're going to run the show version command. That's going to cause some output to happen to the screen. We're going to capture that in a variable called variable 1. We can name this anything we want. It could be more descriptive or less descriptive. Once that's done, we're going to run another task, and we're going to use the debug module, which will simply print out to our screen on Ansible the output or the value of variable 1. So if we save this, we should now be able to run it. So if I run Ansible-playbook-I and point to our Cisco inventory, with the playbook Cisco info.yaml, and we cross our fingers, it should connect up to the remote machine. It should run the show version, and then it should output to the screen here. And that's what we have right here. Okay, so I've got a distribution warning, deprecation warning. We can ignore that for now. Basically, yeah, so it goes into the report information. It says, yep, here's my STD out, which gives me one big, huge, long line. The \ns that you see right here are normally what's a carriage return. So that puts it out all in one line, or it can put it out into an array of lines, which is a little bit easier to read. All right, so we were able to run a command, and that's literally what the iOS commands module does. If we go back into that in playbook, so we ran the show commands. We could actually run multiple commands in here. So for instance, if we wanted more than just the iOS version, we could come in here and specify this as a list of objects and show run, and include additional show commands in there if we wish. We run this, we run the playbook, and the same thing will come out, except this time instead of just the show version, we also get the running configuration. So we've got the show version right there, and then we've got the running configuration down below. All right, and yes, literally any Cisco command you can run there will work. For instance, if we wanted on this machine, say show run, we can then pipe that into an exclude. For instance, if we want to exclude the exclamation marks out of the show run, that speeds up the configuration, makes it a little bit easier to read as opposed to without. Here we can see the exclamation mark are comments. So you can streamline the configuration that you see without those. We could do that same command here in the show run. Show running, and then a pipe exclude exclamation mark in order to exclude that information out. I'm not necessarily going to do that right now because that's simply a matter of changing it. The goal here is just to show that when using the iOS command module, having commands, and then you have a list of commands. Again, we're capturing the output here as a variable, but those could be any commands whatsoever. Which takes us back to our PowerPoint. All right, so we did iOS command in order to show information. Let's go ahead and change the host name on this machine. Now, if you're familiar with Cisco devices, changing host names is actually pretty simple. What we have to do is on our router, we go into configuration mode. So conf t, configuration terminal. Once we're in configuration mode, we simply type host name and our new host name. And then we can see right there in the prompt, the new host name has taken effect immediately. So in order to do that, we basically run the hostname command in Ansible the same way as we did the show version command. So let's see, I want to actually copy my Cisco info. Let's see, Cisco name. And I want to edit the new file. So I copied my existing YAML file to a new one, and I want to edit that one. First thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this second task because we don't want to debug the information anymore. We can also get rid of this register variable and get rid of that one. And let's go ahead and there we go. So that was the very first show iOS version that we had there. Let's take this back, or let's rename this to change hostname. So if I change my command here to simply hostname, let's just call it R1 for simplicity's sake. If I run this, it's going to execute the hostname R1 command on the remote host. And we will see that this will actually fail. I did not give it the new file. Excuse me. Didn't give it the new playbook file. Now it should fail. There we go. So it's telling me, hey, something failed. I tried to run hostname R1 and then hit enter after that. But something happened. Somewhere along the lines, it failed. And this actually comes up to the fact that we can't just simply run hostname R1. We first have to go into configuration mode. And then we can type hostname R1. So for instance, up here, when we ran the command, how far back did I go? There we go. We did conft configuration mode, and then we did hostname, new hostname. So that's what we actually need to do. So if we go back and we edit that playbook, I can come in here to my commands, and remember I can have multiple commands in here, so I can go ahead and put this onto a new line. But before I do that, I need conft. So this should then run the command configure terminal and then go into hostname R1. So let's save that. Let's see, what is my hostname right now? New hostname. Okay. Still, yes. And now I run it, and now it should run two commands in there. First one to go into configuration mode, and then the second one to change the host name. We can see this time, oh yes, succeeded. And so now if we go back to the router and I just hit enter, that configuration should have changed immediately. And we can see R1 there. All right, so we're getting there. I want to make one more adjustment before we move on, however, because I specified here in the configuration file the name of R1. Not every router in my routers group do I want to be called R1. In fact, I have a preferred name for that router in my inventory file. If I look at my inventory file here, I actually had a preferred name of CSR1, and I want CSR1 to be the preferred name, or to be the host name on this machine. So I'm going to edit my playbook one more time, and I'm going to change from hostname R1 to a variable, and I can actually pull this name out of my inventory file as part of that variable. I'll show you how that works. If I edit my playbook again, first off, I come in here, I delete R1, and I replace it with two opening curly braces, inventory underscore hostname, and then two closing curly braces. This basically says, look for a variable that's in Ansible called inventory hostname. And it pulls this right out of the inventory file and sets the hostname for me. So if I have 100 routers in here, it will go through and it will identify the friendly name or the host name that's in my inventory file for all 100 routers, and then automatically configure the host name for them all. Let's try it. So I go ahead and run that configuration, run that playbook. It says, hey, looky right there. It now says it's on CSR1. Let's go back to our router. If I just hit any key, because the configurations take effect immediately, I now see my host name has changed to CSR1. All right. So it looks like it's working. It looks like we've got a way to be able to do it. Anything that we type in those command lines is run on the host. Perfect. So that's the iOS command version of configuring the host name. Now, there were some gotchas we saw there. For instance, we had to type conft in order to go into the configuration mode. This gets even more confusing when you start looking at configuring different router interfaces or lines or ACLs or other aspects of the router, to where how you type the commands, the order you type the commands really matters and could seriously break your system if you do it incorrectly. So in order to combat that, we can look at the Ansible network modules. This is just, I just Googled for Ansible network modules, and there are tons of modules for lots of different devices. A10 networks, ASAs, Delos 10, F5, Cisco iOS, Fortinet, tons of different network devices. The ones we're looking at here are the iOS, Cisco iOS. And so we've been running this iOS command right here, and we can see lots of information about it and then some examples about how to run the commands. Specifically, let's see, there's lots of other ones in here, for instance, for the interfaces, for configuring the interfaces. And we can see as an example here, they have configuring an interface. You configure the name, the description, the speed, duplex, MTU, lots of different information that may or may not be available to you if you don't type them in the right order with the standard iOS command. Specifically, I'm going to look here at the iOS config module. The iOS config module essentially sets me straight into the configuration mode. And here we can see an example. Instead of iOS command, it runs iOS config, and then lines, hostname, inventory hostname. Well, that's exactly what I just tried to do. Here they've got it in 2 different lines, whereas previously I had it in 4 lines. 1 to call the commands, and then conf t and set the host name. So I can actually shorten this up. It will automatically put me into configuration mode as opposed to having to run the specific command, and will configure the host name for me. Well, let's try that. So let's go ahead and edit the Cisco name one more time. This time I'm going to change, instead of iOS command, it's going to be iOS config. And instead of commands, that's going to be lines. And I will go ahead and delete the conf t and just have a host name there. So iOS config throws me into config mode and then allows me to run the hostname command. All right, before I run that, let's go ahead and set the hostname back to something else. And now we run it, and it should look pretty much exactly the same from the end user standpoint, except here it tells me something actually changed. Previously, it didn't tell me anything changed. Previously, it said everything was okay, and it just ran the commands regardless. Here it says everything changed. I can look back at the router. Yes, something changed. And now I rerun this because it's idempotent. It should automatically say, hey, there's nothing necessary to be changed here. The name is already CSR1, therefore there's no need to update it. All right, so there we go. We set up our Cisco devices. We first off started off by verifying connectivity. Could we SSH into the host? We then set up an inventory file with the username and password and IP addresses as appropriate. We then ran some iOS commands just to show the information, just to see if everything was working properly, and it was. We then used the iOS command in order to configure some things, and we did a configure hostname. We could have done any other configurations we wanted to. It would have just simply been a matter of figuring them out. And then lastly, we did an iOS config in order to help streamline our commands. There were a lot of other options here. See, that's the iOS config. There's a lot of other modules here that we could use, for instance, for routing, for systems, users, and so on, all with Cisco devices. And if we use non-Cisco devices, there's tons of other modules there as well. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future.